Hi, everyone, and welcome to segment 2 in our series discussing the IPO process. Today we have Clara Fong from OUM joining us, who will lead this segment. And we also have Herb Cross, the Chief Financial Officer at Atreca, who's gone through the process with both RoseRyan and OUM, and will have some valuable insights for us. So I will turn it over to Clara Fong to take it away.
Great. Thank you, Doug. So just continuing in our series, in addition to getting your lawyers, your bankers, and your consultants all lined up, you'll also have to get your auditors involved as well. I think one of the most important considerations for the auditors in this process is the need to consider whether or not, we're actually independent of the company under PCAOB and SEC standards. These standards are much more stringent than the independent standards under the AICPA. More often than not, your auditors probably have provided services that had their clients been public companies would impair their independence. Some of the more common services that we provide to private company audit clients that would impair our independence include, for example, preparing a company's tax provisions, drafting financials and footnotes, or preparing the technical accounting analyses for complex transactions. So as a result, your auditors will need to carefully evaluate their independence before they can even consider taking you public. So let's move on to the financial statements and the audit, some thoughts on that. As a private company, chances are your audits were probably completed under generally accepted audit standards as governed by the Auditing Standards Board for private companies. What this means is that your auditors will need to get their audits up to PCAOB standards. The PCAOB has its own extensive set of standards for the auditors on how audits should be conducted and what should be considered, which requires fairly robust documentation. That usually means that your auditors would need to go back to those years that will be included in the registration statement and complete additional procedures, or actually even increase the extent of the work that's already been performed. They'll need to ensure that the documentation in their files are more robust than what would typically be required for an audit completed under the standards of the AICPA. Another requirement for auditors of public companies is the need for an engagement quality control review partner, or what we call an EQCR or a second partner. Depending on the audit firm's quality control standards, private companies generally are not required to have a second partner involved. However, public companies and companies undergoing an IPO do. The EQCR is not involved in the day-to-day activities of the audit. Their job is actually just to ensure that significant accounting and audit matters and areas of audit risk are not overlooked by the engagement team. The EQCR is basically a second set of eyes. So then when it comes to footnote disclosures, generally private company disclosures are not as extensive since the objective is to place less burden on the preparer. Private companies also have fewer resources, especially in accounting and finance. And the investors are fewer than if a company were public. As a public company, the investors are more diverse and likely need more information in order to make informed decisions. So our job here will be to review the financials and the footnotes, again, to ensure that all disclosures required for public companies are adequate. Private companies also have the advantage of being able to elect to apply private company counsel alternatives for accounting whenever these are available. These alternatives make things easier for private companies and puts less of a burden on them than adhering to standards required for public companies. As a company looking to go public, however, the adoption of private company counsel alternatives will need to be unwound, and standards applicable to public companies will need to be applied. Consideration of the impact and adoption dates of new accounting pronouncements not yet adopted by the company will also need to be made. If you're an emerging growth company, then you can continue to take advantage of private company adoption dates, which tend to be later than when public companies need to adopt. And then I think the last thought I have pertains to ICFR. Although we won't be opining on the effectiveness of your ICFR, we will be paying closer attention to the existence of deficiencies and whether those arise to the level of a material weakness. So we as your auditors would be working with you in determining whether those material weaknesses should be included in the MD&A in the registration statement. There's just so much to think about, in getting IPO ready. These were just a few really quick thoughts that came to mind as you begin your journey towards becoming a public company. But I think to truly appreciate this process, however, we thought that having someone share their own experience with us would be helpful. So I have with me today Herb Cross, who is the Chief Financial Officer of Atreca. Herb has over 20 years of experience in life science leadership roles and helped bring Atreca public in 2019. Herb, nice to meet you. First I'd like to congratulate you on a very successful IPO and to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to speak with us.
Thanks, Claire. Happy to do it and happy to be here.
Great. So I wanted to, take this opportunity to ask you a few questions about your experience with taking Atreca public, just to give these folks a flavor of what they can expect.
Yeah.
So the first question I have for you is, how did you work with RoseRyan and to help you navigate the IPO process?
So, RoseRyan had been working with us on some kind of rudimentary beginnings of documenting our internal controls over financial reporting in advance of that. Atreca had, pretty good line of sight to our IPO. It wasn't something that was sprung on us by a board. The markets opened up and suddenly it was like, hey, can we get public? How quickly can we go? So I think, with an eye to selecting both OUM as our audit firm about a year and a half prior to the process, as well as selecting RoseRyan from a SOX perspective, from an internal controls and support perspective, we really did it with an eye to an IPO. So I think, they were great in helping us document that. We weren't I've worked at smaller private companies. We were in the neighborhood of about 65, trending towards 75 or 80 people at that point in time. But we still had all the traditional challenges that a small private company does on the internal control side, as far as segregation of duties, financial systems maybe not being as mature and robust as you'd like it to in a public setting. And so I think RoseRyan was a very helpful partner for us in kind of documenting and really kind of eliminating the kind of controls issues that you might have, except for those that you just physically can't, such as not having enough bodies in the building from a segregation of duties perspective, or your financial systems maybe isn't a top tier system that has tons of application-based controls. You're using a less mature system that has some challenges from an application-based controls perspective. And so I think they really helped us kind of narrow it down to those one or two that, frankly, were just a little bit out of our control, so we could focus on those and have the appropriate disclosures around those items kind of ready to go. So they were very, very helpful in that process. And we continue to work with them now on the other side as we ramp in the next year or two towards needing to have full SOX compliance from an audit perspective.
Oh, that's great. Sounds like it sounds like a very good working relationship.
Yeah, no, it'd been great. It'd been great. And I'm lucky enough to have a VP finance and a good controller who've worked with RoseRyan before. So they're very much a known quantity to the team. And it's been actually a really good partnership on that front.
Oh, that's great. So then, that's with RoseRyan. How did you work with your auditors, with OUM, to get you through the IPO process? How did that go?
Yeah, OUM was actually selected as our auditors. I think it was a little more than a year and a half, maybe approaching 2 years prior to the IPO, and it really was with an eye to wanting to make sure we were ready to go. So the audits were being done at the PCAOB level, so we didn't have some of the challenges that some private companies do, where you have to kind of level up your audit and go back and do a bunch of incremental work. I will say, having a high quality auditor like OUM and Doug and his team in there, was hugely helpful. I've come into a number of settings and taken companies public that were much less ready to go and in much shorter and more stressed timeframes. I will say having having Doug and the team on board and working with the company with an eye to making sure that we were ready to go actually made it a fairly painless process on the audit side. Every IPO has its challenges. I'm happy to report that the audit opinions and the auditors and the financials were not one of the challenges we had as we ramped up to go public, because we had a lot of the documentation in place, and it really was more a matter of just getting the most recent quarter done, making sure that that the consents were ready to go, getting everybody through the reviews, comfort letter, all the usual stuff. It's a lot of work, but I think we didn't have a lot of the pre-work that we had to go back and do and catch up on, because we had a good partnership with OUM for a significant period of time in advance of kicking off our process.
Wow, that's great to hear. Good job, Doug. So now that you've been through it and, more than once, what are some of the things that you wished you knew the first time you went through an IPO?
That's a great question. I think, to me, the pitfalls in the IPO process that I think I've always found most painful is that kind of cleanup. In a lot of cases, smaller companies I've taken public, it is a little bit like trying to change the tires on the car while it's going down the freeway at 65 miles an hour, right? I mean, the IPO process itself is a full-time job for the CFO, your finance function, and a number of other kind of ancillary functions in the company, because of the need to support and produce documentation and get through underwriter diligence and everything else. So going into it, understanding that is a huge process, getting kind of your ducks in a row before diving into that process is something that, and I don't fault any of the companies I've been at before I joined for it. It's just not always a priority for small private companies. Things like making sure your equity systems are tight, that you have good stock records, who all your stockholders are, that that whatever system you're using, whether it's Carta or, most private companies aren't on Equity Edge or Solium yet, right? Even if it's an Excel spreadsheet, right? Make sure it's current, make sure it ties, make sure you have current addresses, all that type of stuff in the midst of, it seems like a small thing to figure out and get tied out, but in the midst of an incredibly exhaustive IPO process, it can be the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back. And I think other things like, a lot of the memos and the documentation, upgrading from a AICPA audit to a PCAOB audit is no small task. I know a lot of people think, oh, it's just, do a little more audit work, write a few more memos. It's a little more than that. And then I think the financial systems too, is the other area where I think a lot of companies, I see a lot of companies, and I hope I don't get a nasty letter from counsel over at Quicken at some point here, but I see a lot of companies that have tried to go public with QuickBooks, and it's a challenge, right? I mean, it's something that that you need to really think about. And so for me, for me, a lot of times it becomes, a job criteria when I'm considering a role is, maybe they haven't invested in those things yet. Maybe the staffing isn't quite in place and the systems aren't quite in place, but is there a willingness at the board and at the CEO level to invest in those things when they say they want to be IPO ready? It's one thing to say you want to be ready to go public and you want to get ready to go. It's another thing when the CFO comes back and says, all right, well, then I need a new ERP system. That's going to be, $175,000, and we actually have to have a controller and accounting manager so that your CFO isn't closing the books and posting journal entries. And so I think really investing on the front end to the extent that you can. And again, it can be little things like the equity piece, getting your records cleaned up and in a row, or to more major things like the financial and the ERP systems or staffing up. But those are things that are hard to do once the process is started. And so that's always been my biggest learning is just, even if you can invest in it up front, set realistic expectations, make sure your CEO understands that you're going to have a material weakness because QuickBooks doesn't have any application-based controls, and that's going to be in there, right? You're going to have to disclose that. It's not the end of the world.
Right.
You need to fix that sooner rather than later, but make sure that you manage those expectations. Otherwise, the last thing any of us want is for the auditors or the financials or the consents or the comfort letter to become the gating item on the IPO, right? That's the last thing we want. So
exactly.
there's a lot of ways, a lot of little things you can do, but again, it's prioritization, right? I mean, small private companies or even just private companies have a lot of demands on their time and resources. So you do what you can.
Yep. Those are some
Those are
great
great tips. Yeah, I remember when the company was talking to us about becoming the audit firm and taking over, 2 years prior to the IPO, and we talked about that exact issue, the systems and the potential material weakness there. So
Yeah.
So yeah, it's great.
Yeah. I think a lot of companies underestimate the time and the resources and the cost involved, right, in an IPO.
Absolutely. Yep.
And then I guess my last question, what advice would you give anyone about to embark on their own IPO journey?
Yeah, I'm going to sound a little bit redundant to my last comments, but really would be look to your infrastructure. I mean, again, I think all those things that I highlighted, there's two approaches to them, right? You can invest in them in advance so that you come out the other side of the IPO with well-controlled financial systems, appropriate staffing, a strong, stock system, stock records, and the ability to kind of run your operations day one in a clean, well-controlled way. Or, what seems to be more commonly the case, you maybe check one or two of those boxes and you hit your IPO and you disclose the material weakness around the fact that the CFO is closing the books and posting journal entries so you have no segregation of duties, or your systems don't allow for appropriate applications-based controls. And you kind of just get public, right? And then on the other side, you're trying to figure it out and staff and hire appropriately. And I think either one of those, I think, are you can get it done either way. I've gotten it done both ways. And you can have a very successful IPO and come out the other side. To me, it's just a question of, where are you doing the work? And I will tell you, if doing the work on the front end versus doing the work on the other side of the IPO, it's about 3x on the other side of the IPO, because then you're in the middle of a reporting processes. You've got, all the controls that you have to document on top of that. You've got all the different, staffing and hiring as a public company. You're putting all your internal policies and procedures in place and ramping up your BVA processes to make sure that you're starting to build, functional management level, financial controls. And, it's a little bit of work on the front end can spare you a lot more work on the back end. Because I think the most common thing I see, and I sit on a couple boards now, and I've seen it in a couple different settings, is, people are starting to, I think, get a pretty good sense of what it takes to get public. I don't think people always go into that process understanding what day one as a public company means and how you have to operate and how much more work, and to your point, Clara, spend comes with that, right? And so I think people, and don't get me wrong, as a private company, if the window's there, the cash is there, especially in biotech where capital is king, take it and run. But go into it with your eyes wide open, because it's a lot more work day to day being a public company. And when you're also trying to play catch up on top of that, it has a snowballing effect, and it can be overwhelming if you're not careful and don't go into it eyes wide open. So for me, it all comes back to being willing and taking the time and making the effort to make those investments in the infrastructure as early as possible, ideally pre-IPO, will save you so much time and pain and effort on the other side. It just should really be something that people try and prioritize.
You don't know this, Herb, but you just made a perfect segue into our final segment that's part 4, which is all about life as a public company on, one, now that you've completed the IPO. So thanks for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Happy to. And I wasn't even coached. Look at that.
Yeah, exactly. When you're good, you're good.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much, Herb. I think that was some very valuable insight and feedback regarding your journey. And I think we can segue into the next module.
Great. Well, thank you again. I enjoyed the conversation. Appreciate you guys having me on.
Thank you, Herb.
Thanks, Clara.